The snow had been falling for 6 hours by the time Daniel Carter pressed his palm against his daughter's forehead and felt the heat radiating off her skin like a small furnace. Sophie was 6 years old and burning up. The thermometer he dug out from the back of the bathroom cabinet, the same one he'd used exactly twice since they'd moved to Millhaven 4 months ago, blinked 103.4 degrees Fahrenheit in sharp red digits. He read it twice, then a third time. His hands were steady because he told them to be. But his chest had gone tight and airless in a way he recognized. It was the same feeling he'd had in a hospital corridor 3 years ago, standing outside a room he couldn't bring himself to enter quickly enough. He shook the thought loose. "Okay," he said aloud, to no one, to himself, to the half-unpacked kitchen around him. The cardboard boxes still stacked against the wall, because something about fully settling in had felt like a concession he wasn't ready to make. Okay, Sophie lay on the living room couch beneath every blanket Daniel owned. Her lips slightly parted, her breathing making a faint whistle on the exhale that he didn't like. He'd already called the after-hours line for her pediatrician, listened to 7 minutes of hold music, then gotten a recording that told him the clinic was closed due to weather, and to call 911 inches case of emergency. He stood over her and tried to calculate what constituted an emergency. Her breathing was wrong but not alarming. Her color was pale, but not blue. She had opened her eyes twice and said, "Daddy, my throat hurts," which meant she was conscious and verbal, which meant he didn't know what that meant. He wasn't a doctor. He fixed motorcycles. He stood at the window and watched the snow come down in thick curtains across the empty street. And it occurred to him that even if he loaded Sophie into the truck and drove carefully, the nearest ER was 40 minutes away. In conditions like this, and the mountain road between here and Cedar Falls had already been closed once this month for ice. That was when he noticed the light across the narrow strip of driveway. His neighbor, the woman in Unit 4B, the one he'd spoken to exactly 3 times since moving in, always brief, always polite, always with the sense that she was giving him space he hadn't asked for, but clearly needed, had her kitchen light on. At 2:14 inches the morning, he stood there for 11 seconds. He counted them. Then he put on his coat and walked across the driveway in 6 inches of fresh snow and knocked. She answered almost immediately, as if she'd heard something before he knocked. She was still wearing her scrubs, dark navy blue, the word Millhaven Regional stitched in white on the breast pocket, and she had a mug of something in her hand, and her dark blonde hair pulled back in a loose knot that was mostly fallen out. She looked at his face and then immediately passed him toward his front door. "Sophie," she said, "she has a fever of 103, and something's off with her breathing." The mug was on the counter before he finished the sentence. She was already reaching for a small bag on the hook by her door, not a purse. Something more deliberate, a zippered canvas case that she clearly kept ready. "Let's go," she said. Her name was Claire Whitfield. He had known this. He had not thought of her as anything other than the neighbor with the night shifts and the quiet mornings until she walked into his living room at 2:15 a.m. and knelt beside his daughter with a penlight and 2 fingers pressed lightly to Sophie's neck, her whole body radiating a calm so particular and practiced that Daniel felt the tightness in his chest loosen slightly just from being near it. "Sophie," she said softly. "Hi, sweetheart. I'm Claire. I'm a nurse. Can you open your mouth really wide for me?" Sophie, half asleep and miserable, opened her mouth. Claire looked, clicked off the light, and sat back on her heels. "Strep throat," she said. "Possibly the beginning of something more, but I think just strep. Her breathing sounds a little congested, but there's no wheeze, and her color's okay. She needs antibiotics, fluids, and sleep." She looked up at him. "Does she have a pediatrician here in Millhaven yet?" "Yes. Dr. Heston. I know her. She's good." Claire was already pulling out her phone. "I'm going to text her right now. She'll call you in the morning with a prescription." In the meantime, she stood and looked around his kitchen with quiet assessment. "Do you have honey? Lemon? Warm water?" He found all 3. For the next 40 minutes, Claire Whitfield managed his kitchen and his daughter, and the long, strange quiet of a snowstorm, like someone who had done exactly this, or something very like it. 1,000 times before. She made Sophie drink warm honey lemon water in small sips. She dampened a cloth and folded it across Sophie's forehead. She sat on the edge of the couch and hummed something low and formless that seemed to have no beginning or end. At 3 a.m., Sophie's fever had dropped to 102.1. At 3:12 a.m., Sophie took Claire's hand in her sleep and didn't let go. Daniel stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and watched this, and something shifted in him that he didn't have a word for yet. "You should sleep," Claire said, without turning around. "I'll stay until she cools down more. Then I'll go." "You just worked a 12-hour shift," he said. 13, actually. A pause. "I'll be fine." He didn't argue. He sat in the armchair across from them and told himself he'd stay awake, and he didn't. When he woke at 6 a.m., the couch had a note tucked under Sophie's feet. "Fever at 101 when I left. Dr. Heston will call before 9. She's going to be okay." See, Daniel read the note twice. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, which was something he hadn't done with a piece of paper in 3 years. Emily Carter had died on a Tuesday in February, which Daniel always thought was somehow the most Emily thing about the whole terrible situation. She had never been the kind of person to make a dramatic exit on a Friday or a Sunday. She was efficient and precise, and she had died in the middle of the week at 11. 47 inches the morning while Sophie was at preschool, and Daniel was at the shop with his hands inside a Harley-Davidson engine, which meant he got the call, drove to the hospital, and was there in time to hold her hand, but not in time for her to know it. She had been sick for 14 months. Pancreatic cancer, which the doctors explained with charts and statistics that Daniel had understood intellectually and not at all emotionally. He had understood the charts and taken Sophie to school and answered emails and fixed motorcycles and cooked dinner and sat next to Emily while she slept and not cried, not once, because if he stopped moving, he would have to feel the size of what was happening to them, and he was not sure he would survive the feeling. After she died, he kept moving. He sold the house in Denver because every room in it had a history he couldn't navigate anymore. He found a small repair shop in Millhaven that was for sale, a town small enough that people mostly left each other alone. And he packed Sophie and 2 trucks worth of boxes and drove north into the mountains. He did not fully unpack, because unpacking would mean this was permanent. The boxes in the kitchen corner were a negotiation he was still having with himself about whether he had the right to be somewhere new. Sophie, in the adaptable way of 6-year-olds, had mostly adjusted. She had a classroom and a teacher named Mrs. Park and a best friend named Lily and opinions about what she would and would not eat for breakfast. She had a stuffed elephant named Gerald, who slept with her every night. She had not forgotten her mother. She talked about Emily, sometimes with a matter-of-factness that broke Daniel's heart and filled it simultaneously. But she was, essentially, okay. Daniel was less okay. He was functional, which he had confused for okay for about 2.5 years now. He noticed Claire Whitfield, the way he noticed most things in Millhaven peripherally, accurately, without engagement. She kept odd hours. She drove a reliable gray sedan. She always brought her own groceries in one trip. She had once left a casserole dish on his doorstep with a post-it that said, "Made too much, please don't feel obligated," and he had eaten every bit of it and returned the dish with a thank you note that was perhaps more formal than the situation required. She had not tried again after that. He had noticed this too. What he had not noticed, or had refused to notice, was that she had been quietly watching over them without making it his problem. The driveway between their units was 6 feet wide. She had shoveled it the week they moved in without being asked. She had once seen Sophie drop her glove from the front step and had picked it up and left it on his doormat with a small stone on top so the wind wouldn't take it. He had noticed these things in the way a man notices the weather as data, not as warmth. After the night of Sophie's fever, something recalibrated. He couldn't have said what, exactly. Claire had not done anything particularly remarkable. She had been competent and kind, which were things nurses were supposed to be. She had not tried to connect with him beyond what the situation required. She had left a note and gone home to sleep, but Sophie had taken her hand. And Daniel had seen it, and had felt something shift, and was now trying to figure out what to do with that which was, he recognized, a different problem than any problem he had allowed himself to have for a very long time. Dr. Heston called at 8:43 a.m. and called in a prescription for amoxicillin, which Daniel picked up from the pharmacy on Main Street, while Sophie sat buckled in the back seat in her pajamas, and Gerald, the elephant, eating a sleeve of crackers and watching snowflakes hit the window with an expression of scientific interest. "Are the snowflakes different from Denver snowflakes?" she asked. "I think snowflakes are the same everywhere. I think these ones are bigger," Sophie said, with the certainty of someone whose opinion was not open to debate. He agreed that these ones might be bigger. That afternoon, settled with medicine and juice, and a show about a girl who solved mysteries with her dog. Sophie asked, "Is Claire coming back?" "I don't know," Daniel said. "Maybe. She sang something when I was asleep." "I know. I liked it," Sophie said, and turned back to her show. He made soup from scratch that evening, which was not something he did often. He found a recipe on his phone and followed it slowly. The kitchen, filling with the smell of carrots and thyme. And when it was done and Sophie had eaten 2 bowls and fallen asleep by 8, he stood in the kitchen for a while thinking. Then he put some soup in a container and walked across the driveway. Claire answered in sweatpants and a university pullover, her hair down, a book open in her hand. She looked at the container, and then at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "Sophie's better," he said. "I'm glad." "This is," he held out the container. "Thank you. For last night, I didn't know what I was doing." "You knew exactly what you were doing," she said. "You knocked on the door." He stood there a moment, not sure what to say to that. "It's chicken soup," he added. "It's probably not as good as the casserole." "I'm still learning." Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, softer than that. She took the container. "Thank you, Daniel." He nodded and went home. 2 weeks later, Sophie, fully recovered and operating at her usual velocity, escaped the front door before he could catch her, and ran directly to Claire's car as Claire was unloading groceries. "Claire," Sophie announced, as if reporting breaking news. Claire, to her credit, did not flinch. "Sophie," she said, matching the energy entirely. "How's your throat?" "All better." "Do you want to come see my elephant?" "His name is Gerald." Sophie Daniel started. "I would love to meet Gerald," Claire said, and looked at Daniel over Sophie's head with an expression that was half question, half apology for the lack of one. He held the door open. Gerald was introduced. Gerald was admired. Tea was made. Sophie talked for 40 minutes without pause about Gerald, her classroom, Lily, the specific texture of the cafeteria's pizza, and a dream she'd had about a horse who could speak Spanish. Claire listened to all of it with her full attention, asking questions that made Sophie light up, not the performative questions adults aimed at children, but real ones, the kind that meant she was actually curious. When Sophie finally ran out of things to say and started on her homework at the kitchen table, Claire set down her mug and said, quietly, "She's extraordinary." "I know," Daniel said. A pause. Outside, the snow had started again. "She talks about her mother sometimes," he said. "Emily. She'll just mention her, like she's still somewhere nearby." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, "Maybe she is. In the ways that count." It was not a complicated thing to say. It was, possibly, the exact right thing. And Daniel found that he could not respond to it, so he didn't, and Claire did not require him to. They sat in the kitchen while the snow fell outside, and Sophie worked on subtraction problems, and the soup warmed on the stove, and nothing particular happened. And it was, Daniel realized later, one of the more peaceful hours he'd had in 3 years. The second time Claire's nursing instincts saved the night. It wasn't medical. It was a Saturday in January, 2 months after the fever, and the library had called to remind Daniel that his account had overdue books. He drove Sophie there to return them, and in the children's section, Sophie found a book about a girl whose mother died and was eventually filled up by the photographs her father took. Sophie took it off the shelf and read the first 4 pages standing in the aisle. Then she sat down on the floor between the shelves and cried the way she almost never cried, not the sharp, immediate cry of a hurt knee or a frustration, but something deeper and without edge, the kind of crying that doesn't know how to stop once it starts. Daniel knelt beside her and held her, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and he understood that she wasn't crying about the book. They stayed on the library floor for a long time. When they got home, Sophie was quiet in the particular way that meant she had gone somewhere inside herself. She ate dinner in small bites, and didn't talk about Gerald or Lily or Spanish-speaking horses. She went to bed at 7:30 without argument, which was how Daniel knew things were serious. He stood in the hall outside her room for 20 minutes after she fell asleep. Then he walked across the driveway. He didn't knock. He sat on the step outside Claire's door in the cold, not sure what he was doing there. And after a few minutes the door opened, and Claire stood in the light behind him with 2 mugs of tea. She sat down next to him on the step. She handed him a mug. She pulled her coat tighter. "Sophie?" she asked. "Bad day?" Claire nodded. She didn't ask for more. She drank her tea. "She found a book," he said eventually. "About a girl whose mother—" He stopped. "She cried for a long time." "Of course she did," Claire said, and there was nothing in her voice except acknowledgement. No performance of sadness, no excessive gentleness, just recognition. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," he said. It was the first time he had said this out loud to another adult since Emily died, and the sound of it surprised him. "You sat on the floor with her until she was done," Claire said. "That's doing it right." He stared at the patch of snow between their doorsteps. "I don't talk about this," he said, "to anyone. I know. I don't know why I'm talking about it now." She thought about this for a moment. Maybe you needed to be cold and outside, and next to someone who wasn't going to tell you what to do about it. He looked at her. She was watching the snow with a kind of unhurried attention. Her hands around the mug, steam curling up between them. "Did you lose someone?" he asked. "My parents, when I was 9. They died in a car accident 6 months apart. My dad in the accident, my mother from something unrelated that grief probably made worse." She said it plainly, the way people say things they have lived with long enough that the edges have smoothed. "My grandmother raised me. She was the one who said I should become a nurse. Why? She said she'd watched me with every hurt animal and every sick neighbor my whole childhood, and that I had the kind of attention that people needed when they were frightened." Claire paused. "She wasn't wrong. She wasn't," Daniel said. They sat there in the cold for another 20 minutes, not talking very much. When he finally went back inside, Sophie was still asleep. Her breathing even and soft, Gerald tucked under her arm. Daniel stood in her doorway and thought about Claire's grandmother saying that some people had the kind of attention that others needed when they were frightened. He had not, until recently, allowed himself to notice that kind of attention when it was directed at him. He had taken it from Sophie's teachers and Sophie's doctor, and the people at the shop who asked how things were going. And he had deflected it not rudely, just efficiently, the way you redirect a conversation back to the topic at hand. He was not sure when Claire had gotten past that particular defense. He was not sure she had even tried to, which was perhaps the whole point. It started with one dinner, and became something neither of them named. The first time, he invited her formally, "Would you like to come to dinner Saturday?" as a proper thank you, and she accepted in the same register, and they had pasta and wine, and Sophie presided over the table, like a small, benevolent host, directing the conversation, and occasionally standing on her chair to make points that required emphasis. The second time happened because Sophie asked Claire directly in the driveway if she wanted to come for soup. And Claire looked at Daniel, and he nodded. And that was the negotiation. By the 5th or 6th Sunday, they had stopped counting. Or rather, they had stopped noticing that they were counting. It was simply what Sunday evenings were. Sophie had assigned Claire a specific seat at the table, the one nearest the window. And if you ask Sophie why, she would tell you it was because Claire liked to see the snow. Claire did like to see the snow. Daniel had noticed this independently. He had started cooking again, really cooking, not just assembling things. He bought a cookbook at the hardware store because it was the only store in Millhaven that sold cookbooks. And he made his way through it slowly. Some weeks tentative, some weeks confident, always with Sophie as his tasting committee. Too much pepper, Sophie would say, deeply serious. Noted, Daniel would say. He had also, quietly, unpacked 3 more boxes from the kitchen corner. He did not make an event of it. One day the boxes were there, and the next day they were in the recycling, and the kitchen felt slightly larger, and he did not examine his feelings about this too carefully. Claire brought things. Bread from the bakery on 3rd Street, a jar of local honey that Sophie immediately claimed for personal use, once a small pot of rosemary from the grocery store's seasonal shelf that she planted in his windowsill with the pragmatic authority of someone who did not ask permission before improving things. "You'll remember to water it?" she said. "I'll try," he said. "I'll remind you," she said, which he understood was a quiet declaration that she intended to still be here when it needed water. He didn't say anything. He put the rosemary in the window where it would get light, and he watched Sophie count the leaves with intense scientific seriousness. And he let the moment be what it was. Sophie, one evening in late January, looked at Claire across the table and said, "Can I call you our Hannah?" Daniel looked up. Claire looked slightly startled. "My name's actually Claire, sweetheart," Claire said. Sophie considered this. "I know, but our Hannah is the name I have for you in my head. It's the name for the person who's ours. A silence. Hannah is my middle name," Claire said finally. And her voice was different, not unsteady, but softer. "How did you know?" "I didn't," Sophie said, satisfied, and went back to her dinner. Daniel kept his eyes on his plate for a long moment. When he looked up, Claire was watching Sophie with an expression he had no word for, something between wonder and recognition and a careful, tended to hope. He had seen that expression before. Once. On Emily's face. The day they'd brought Sophie home from the hospital. That specific quality of looking at someone and understanding that your life had arranged itself permanently around them. He put this observation carefully aside. Not away aside. Which was different. He had learned the difference. "The rosemary's doing well," he said. "I noticed," Claire said, and looked at him, and there was a warmth in her eyes that was not new but that she had, until now, kept politely muted, and now she wasn't, and he looked back, and neither of them looked away. Sophie, eating her soup, noticed none of this, or noticed all of it, or understood it in the wordless way that children sometimes understand the things happening just above them, and said nothing. It was Claire who told him first. They were in his kitchen after Sophie had gone to bed a Thursday, not a Sunday, the routine having quietly expanded, and she was at the counter cutting bread, and he was making coffee, and the silence between them was the kind that had weight and texture rather than absence. She said, without preamble, "My grandmother died 2 years ago. I moved to Millhaven because she'd always said it was beautiful in winter, and I had never actually seen it. I arrived in November." A pause. "I don't have much family. Some cousins in Vermont I see at Christmas. That's it." He set down the coffee and looked at her. "I chose this," she said. "The smallness. I'm not looking for your sympathy. I just wanted you to know why I'm the way I am." She made a small gesture with the bread knife that seemed to mean something she didn't have other words for. "Self-sufficient, maybe overly." "You're not overly anything," he said. She considered this. "I'm not very good at wanting things. Or saying, I want them. You planted rosemary in my window." The corner of her mouth moved. "That was a strategic operation." "I know," he said. He poured 2 mugs and brought them to the table and sat down. And she sat across from him with the bread between them. And it was very quiet. "Emily was funny," he said. It surprised him. He had not planned to say this. "She was genuinely the funniest person I knew. She would have thought the situation I'm in now, single father, trying to cook from a hardware store cookbook, rosemary on my windowsill, was absolutely hilarious. She would have texted her sister a play-by-play. Claire didn't try to say anything. She listened. I miss her humor most. You'd think you'd miss the big things first. But I miss the specific way she laughed at a particular kind of thing. He wrapped his hands around the mug. Sophie has her laugh. Not the same, but similar. I hear it sometimes, and it stops me. That sounds like both the worst thing and the most precious thing, Claire said. Yes. He looked at her. Both at the same time? Always. She nodded. I'm afraid, he said, and this was also not planned, also surprising, also true, that if I let myself move forward, I'm letting her go. Like forward motion means I'm agreeing that she's gone. He paused. Which is insane, because she's been gone for 3 years. It's not insane, Claire said. It's loyalty. It's just loyalty pointed in a direction that can't receive it anymore. The kitchen was very still. What do you do with that? He asked. I think she was slow and careful with it. As if she'd thought about this before, but from a different angle. I think you let it go somewhere it can be used. You don't stop being loyal. You just redirect it. He thought about Sophie's laugh, about Rosemary on the windowsill, about a note tucked under a sick child's feet at 6 in the morning. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not romantic, not yet, or not only. It was the gesture of someone saying, I hear you and thank you, and I see you, too, all at once. And Claire looked at their hands, and then at him. And she turned her hand over, so their palms were together, and they sat like that for a while. The coffee went cold. Neither of them moved. Outside, the snow fell on Millhaven, in the particular way it fell when it intended to stay steady and quiet and without apology, and in the kitchen the rosemary stood small and green on the windowsill, and the bread went uneaten, and the silence between them became something they were building together, the way you build something you intend to use for a long time. Emily's parents arrived on a Saturday in early February with a casserole, and the best intentions of people who were managing their own grief imperfectly. Gerald and Lois Shaw, Emily's mother and father, were in their late 60s, still upright and sharp, still organized around Emily's absence the way a building is organized around a missing column, structurally altered, compensating everywhere. They adored Sophie with a ferocity that Daniel respected and was, occasionally, slightly afraid of. They called every Sunday at noon and sent packages with unnecessary regularity, and still referred to Daniel's house as where Sophie lives, which was technically true but told you something about how they framed things. They were good people. They were also still, Daniel understood, standing at the edge of something they had not finished falling from. They arrived at noon. By 2 o'clock, they had noticed the rosemary on the windowsill and the second mug on the coffee table, and a pair of cooking classes receipts on the counter he had enrolled. Finally, in the series at the community center, and Lois Shaw had gone slightly quiet in a particular way. Claire was not there that day. She was working a day shift, which Daniel had not arranged but which was, he thought afterward, fortunate for everyone. At 3 o'clock, Gerald Shaw said carefully, Sophie mentioned a neighbor, Claire. She does live next door, Daniel said. Sophie seems quite attached. Sophie is Sophie, Daniel said. She's attached to everyone who's kind to her. Lois put down her tea. Daniel. Her voice was gentle and unhappy, both at once. We're not trying to. She stopped. Started again. Emily has been gone for 3 years. We know that. We're not naive. I know you're not. We just... She looked at Gerald, who looked back at her. And something passed between them that Daniel recognized as the shorthand of long grief shared. She was our daughter. She was my wife, he said, and kept his voice even. A silence. No one is trying to replace anyone, he said. That's not how it works. Sophie knows her mother. She talks about her. The photograph in the living room isn't going anywhere. He looked at them both. But I have to figure out how to live, Gerald. I have to figure out how to live in a way that isn't just survival. For Sophie's sake, and honestly for mine. Another silence. Longer. Lois Shaw looked at the rosemary on the windowsill for a long moment. Then she said, Emily always killed rosemary. I know, Daniel said. She'd tell me I overwatered it. And she was right. Every time. Something shifted in Lois's face. Cracked slightly. She talked about you, Lois said. And her voice was smaller now. Before she went, She talked about you needing to. She said she worried you'd. She stopped again. I know, Daniel said softly. I found the journal. He hadn't meant to say that yet, but there it was. Gerald cleared his throat. We should let you get on with your day, he said, in the tone of a man who has decided that enough honesty has happened for one afternoon, and it should be honored by ending gracefully. They left at 4. Sophie stood in the doorway and waved until their car turned the corner. When Daniel closed the door, Sophie was still standing at the window. Grandma was sad today, Sophie said. She was, he agreed. Is she sad about Mama? Always a little. Sophie thought about this. I'm sad about Mama sometimes too. But then I think about how she used to make the funny voice when she read to me, and I feel better and sad at the same time. She turned from the window. Is that okay? That's exactly okay, Daniel said. That's exactly right. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went to find Gerald the elephant. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the rosemary and thought about a journal he had found 6 weeks ago, in a box he had been putting off unpacking, in Emily's handwriting on pages worn soft at the edges, on a night when the snow was so thick it muffled everything. He had found it in December, in a box marked Office Emily, under a layer of notebooks and folders, and the kind of practical accumulation that offices generate and grief preserves. He had almost closed the box. He had, in fact, closed it, and opened it again, and stood there for a while, before he took the journal out. It was a green cloth-covered thing, no label, the kind sold in drugstores. Emily had used it the last year of her illness. He could tell by the dates on the early pages, which he skimmed, not reading. He was not sure he had the right to read. Then he thought, if anyone had the right, it was him. He sat down on the floor of the half-unpacked bedroom with the journal in his lap. She wrote the way she talked, directly, without much decoration, with occasional wry asides that made the reading both easier and harder. He skipped forward, past the early pages. He was not looking for anything specific. He was not sure what he was looking for. He found it in the last 20 pages. She had written about him, at length, in the months when she was well enough to write, and already certain of how things would go. She had written about Sophie and what Sophie would become. With a confidence he recognized as hers, that particular certainty she had about people she loved. As if she could simply decide what they would be. She had written, Sophie will be remarkable, not because she'll be remarkable at any one thing, but because she will always choose people over being right. Daniel taught her that, even though he doesn't know it. He had to stop and stare at the ceiling for a while. Further on, she had written about him directly. I know he'll be okay with Sophie, she had written. I know that absolutely. What I don't know is whether he'll be okay with himself. He doesn't think he needs people. He's wrong, but he doesn't know it yet. He needs someone patient enough to outlast his politeness. He read this 3 times. I want him to love someone again, she had written. And the handwriting on that line was slightly different, more deliberate. As if she had decided to mean it as precisely as possible. Not because I want to be replaced. Because I want him to be real. I want him to have Sunday evenings and someone to cook for, and the kind of quiet that comes from being known. He deserves that. He has always deserved that, and never asked for it. And then, if he finds someone like that, someone who gets him right, who sees through the practical and into the Daniel underneath it, I want him to know that I gave that my blessing. I want him to have that in writing, because he's the kind of person who needs things in writing. There, at the bottom of the page, she had signed her name. Just her name. In the handwriting he knew as well as his own. Emily. He sat on the floor of the half-unpacked bedroom until he couldn't anymore, and then he set the journal carefully on the nightstand and turned off the light and lay down fully dressed on top of the covers and let himself, finally, after 3 years, cry in the way he had been refusing to cry without any particular goal, without managing the volume or the duration, without thinking about what came next. It took a long time. When it was over, he felt emptied and, strangely, less heavy. He lay in the dark and thought, someone patient enough to outlast his politeness. He thought about a woman who had put rosemary in his window and called it a strategic operation. He thought about a note tucked under Sophie's feet at 6 in the morning, written in the handwriting of someone who had been awake all night and still took the time to write clearly. He thought, she knew, not Claire Emily. Emily had somehow, in the last careful months of her life, known the shape of what he would need, and she had given him permission in the only language he trusted completely. In writing, he got up and went to Sophie's room and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the small shape of his daughter in the dark, and thought, okay, Em, okay. Then he went back to bed and slept for the first time in recent memory without dreaming of hospitals. It was Sophie who made it simple. She did this the way Sophie made most complicated things simple, by asking the direct question that the adults in her life had been talking carefully around for weeks. It was a Sunday in March. The snow was still on the ground, but the quality of the light had changed thinner, more tentative, the sky a pale blue instead of the pressed pewter of deep winter. Sophie and Daniel were making pancakes, which had become the Sunday morning ritual that existed in parallel with the Sunday evening ritual. And Claire was at the table with coffee watching them, which had become its own kind of ritual that none of them had announced. Sophie, very seriously pouring batter, said, "Claire, could you be my second mom?" The kitchen went quiet. Claire set down her mug. Daniel did not look up from the pan. "Sophie," he started. "I'm not asking you, Daddy. I'm asking Claire." Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you a question first?" Sophie turned to look at her, batter-covered spoon in hand. "Do you still love your mom?" Claire asked. "Your real mom?" "Yes," Sophie said, without hesitation. "Do you think loving someone else would make you love her less?" Sophie thought about this with the genuine seriousness she gave to difficult questions. "No," she said finally, "because I love you and I love Daddy and I love Gerald and I don't love any of them less because of the others." "That's right," Claire said. "That's exactly right." She paused. "So, here's what I want you to know. I can't be your mom. You have a mom. But I can be someone who loves you and is here for you and makes sure you have what you need. There's a word for that, but the word doesn't matter as much as the thing itself." Sophie considered this for a long moment. "Could I call you Claire?" Sophie said. "You can call me whatever feels right." "I think Claire is right," Sophie said, with the authority of someone who has made a final decision, "because that's who you actually are." She went back to her pancakes. Daniel looked at Claire across the kitchen. His eyes were doing something he couldn't control, and he was not going to apologize for it. Claire's face had that quality again, the one from the Sunday evening months ago, the precise and careful hope, and she looked back at him steadily. "She's something," Claire said. "I know," he said. "She's all of the best things about her mother, and all of the best things about you." He set down the spatula. "Claire," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said quietly. She did know. He could see that she knew, and that she had been waiting not impatiently, not with expectation, just with the particular endurance of someone who had learned to trust that the right things eventually found their footing. "I'm not," he stopped again. "I'm still figuring it out." "So am I," she said. "We can figure it out from the same direction." Sophie, without turning around, said, "The pancakes are burning." Daniel turned back to the pan. He rescued the pancakes. Behind him, he heard Claire laugh a real laugh, warm and sudden, the kind you can't plan. He had not heard her laugh like that before, not fully, and the sound of it filled the kitchen like something that had been missing from it. He thought, this is what Emily meant. This exact sound. Sophie looked between them with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan has come together. The snow began to release Millhaven in late March. It didn't happen all at once. Nothing in Colorado happened all at once, but in small, daily surrenders. The icicles along the roof shortened by an inch each morning. The driveway between units 4A and 4B became passable without boots. Sophie stopped needing her warmest coat. The light in the evening stretched further and further, until one day Daniel noticed that it was still pale gold outside at 7 o'clock, and felt something in him respond to this that he hadn't felt in longer than he could say precisely. The rosemary in the kitchen window had doubled in size. Daniel had been in the cooking class for 6 weeks and had graduated from the hardware store cookbook to something more ambitious. And on a Saturday evening in early April, he made dinner from scratch for all 3 of them: roasted chicken, vegetables, fresh bread he had made himself on his second attempt. And when it came out right, Sophie put her hands on the table and said, "Daddy," in the exact tone she used for genuine astonishment, and Claire tasted the bread and said, quietly, "Daniel, this is genuinely excellent." And he felt a pride so ordinary and uncomplicated that it surprised him. He had forgotten that pleasure could be ordinary. After dinner, after Sophie was in bed, he and Claire walked outside into the still cool spring evening. The subdivision was quiet. The mountains beyond the town were lit silver at their peaks, the lower slopes already showing the first green. They walked to the end of the block and back. She had her hands in her jacket pockets. He had his hands in his. At some point this changed and her hand was in his, and neither of them remarked on it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Okay, and I want you to know that whatever you say," this he meant everything. The hand, the Sunday evenings, the kitchen, the rosemary, all of it, this doesn't change. "I'm not making it contingent." She looked at him in the careful way she had. "I have something for you," he said. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. He had been carrying it in his jacket pocket for 2 weeks, not from planning but from the particular indecision of a man who keeps reaching for the moment, and then deciding it isn't quite the right one, and then one evening understanding that he'd been waiting for a specific feeling, and the specific feeling had arrived without announcement, and the moment was now, on a sidewalk in early April, with the mountains lit silver, and his daughter asleep inside. He took out a ring. It was not elaborate. It was a simple band, with a small, clear stone he had driven to Cedar Falls, and spent an afternoon in a jewelry shop with a woman named Rosalind, who had asked him the right questions and helped him understand what he was looking for, which was something that said, "I chose this deliberately," without saying anything louder than that. Claire looked at it. "I'm not proposing to be fast," he said. "I know it's been the timeline is." "Daniel," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. A pause. "I haven't technically asked yet." "I know." Her voice was steady and warm and certain. "Yes, anyway." He put the ring on her finger. Her hand was very still. He held it in both of his for a moment, and then he looked up at her, and her eyes were bright, and she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, and they stood like that on the sidewalk in the early spring dark, while the snow retreated from the mountains, and the air smelled like cold water and new dirt. "Emily," he said, quietly. Not to Claire, to the air, to the mountains, to whatever remained in the world of the woman he had loved first. She wrote, she said. "I know," Claire said softly. She didn't know what was in the journal, but she knew what mattered. "I know." They went inside. They were married in June, in the backyard of the townhouse, a backyard that existed, it turned out, once the snow finished retreating, and that Sophie immediately colonized with a garden that Claire helped her plant, flowers and herbs, rosemary naturally. Sophie wore a white dress and flowers in her hair, and took her responsibilities as flower girl with maximum seriousness, walking ahead of them with the focused deliberateness of someone who had been practicing. Gerald and Lois Shaw sat in the front row, and Lois cried. And Daniel was glad she did, because it meant she was there, which meant Emily was there, in the way things you have loved enough remain present. On the small table at the edge of the garden, among the flowers, there was a photograph. Emily Carter, laughing at something just outside the frame the way she always laughed, as if the funniest thing in the world had just happened, and she was the first to catch it. The ceremony was short. The afternoon was long. Sophie ate too much cake, and said so without apology. Afterward, when the few guests had gone, and Sophie was inside, watching something with Gerald the elephant, and the garden was very quiet, Daniel and Claire sat on the back steps in the late light. "She would have liked you," he said. "I think I would have liked her," Claire said. "She was funny, I know." "Sophie has it. She does." A pause. The light on the mountains was going gold to amber. "Are you okay?" Claire asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he had learned, slowly, to be honest about such things. "Yeah," he said. "I think I actually am." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The garden smelled like rosemary and new soil, and the specific quality of a summer evening that is more beautiful than it has any right to be. In the kitchen window, the window of their kitchen, the house that was finally, fully unpacked the original rosemary plant, stood in its pot in the fading light. Green and persistent, taller than anyone had expected it to get. Sophie appeared at the back door. "Are you guys being romantic again?" she said. "Extremely," Claire said. Sophie made a noise of theatrical disgust and went back inside. A moment later they heard her telling Gerald the elephant about the situation, her voice carrying the precise tone of someone who finds adults baffling but has accepted their limitations. Daniel laughed. It was quiet and uncomplicated, and entirely his own. He thought about the version of himself who had stood at a window 14 months ago, watching a kitchen light across a driveway at 2 in the morning, counting 11 seconds before he knocked. He thought about how much can change in a year if you let it. Not change meaning replace. Change meaning grow. Expand. Take in more light. Somewhere above the mountains, the first stars were coming out over Millhaven. And the night was warm enough that they didn't go in for a long time. Some families don't end. They grow new shapes. They find new rooms. The love that was there first doesn't leave, it makes space, the way good things do, for more love to come in. And in the morning, someone waters the rosemary, and it grows.